The metal tray slammed against the stone floor with a loud, echoing clang. The sound filled the cold prison room. A tin can of American rations rolled across the dusty floorboards. Hard biscuits shattered as they hit the ground. Lukewarm black coffee spilled from the cup and spread slowly across the floor like dark ink. The young American guard stood frozen. Across the table sat a captured German officer. Not just any officer. An SS Standartenführer, a high-ranking Nazi colonel. His black uniform was spotless despite the chaos of war. The silver insignia on his collar gleamed under the weak light of the room. His boots were polished. His posture was perfect. He slowly crossed his legs. Then he leaned back in the wooden chair. The expression on his face was pure contempt. He looked at the spilled food on the ground like it was garbage. Then he looked up at the young American soldier guarding him. The guard couldn't have been more than 19 years old. Barely old enough to shave. The German officer spoke slowly, his voice calm but filled with arrogance. "I am a senior officer of the German military." He paused. "As a prisoner of war, I am entitled to officers' rations under the Geneva Convention." His cold blue eye stared directly at the young American. "I will not eat this swill." The word dripped with disgust. "I demand a proper hot meal, and I demand to speak with your commanding officer immediately." The room went silent. The American private didn't yell. He didn't threaten the prisoner. He didn't raise his rifle. Instead, he simply looked down at the spilled food on the floor. The dented tin. The broken biscuits. The coffee soaking into the dirt. Then he slowly nodded. Without saying a word. He turned around. And walked out of the room. The heavy door closed behind him with a dull thud. Inside the cold stone room, the SS officer smiled. He believed he had won. In his mind, the Americans were weak. Undisciplined. Soft. He was certain the young guard would soon return with an apology. And a better meal. Maybe even a steak. Because that was how things worked in the world he came from. Rank demanded respect. And he believed his rank still mattered. But the German colonel had no idea what was about to happen. He had no idea who was visiting the command post that morning. And he had absolutely no idea that General George S. Patton was about to walk through that door. To understand why this moment would become so explosive, we need to go back a few months. Winter. Europe was freezing. The Battle of the Bulge had just ended. It was one of the most brutal battles of World War II. And one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades. American soldiers from the U.S. Third Army had been fighting for weeks in temperatures far below zero. The forests of the Ardennes were a nightmare. Snow piled high between the trees. The wind cut through uniforms like knives. For the men fighting there, hell wasn't fire. Hell was ice. The soldiers marched through frozen mud. They slept in foxholes filled with snow. Their rifles froze. Their boots froze. Sometimes even their blood froze. Many soldiers lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Food was scarce. What they ate was exactly what had been on that metal tray. Cold meat from a tin can. Hard biscuits that could break a tooth. And coffee that tasted like muddy water. But they ate it. Because they had no choice. These men had crossed the Atlantic Ocean to stop the Nazi war machine. They had fought through North Africa. Through Sicily. Through France. And now they were pushing Germany's armies back toward the Rhine River. Every mile forward cost lives. Friends died beside them. Explosions shook the ground. Artillery screamed overhead. And yet they kept marching. Because they believed they were fighting to end one of the darkest regimes in history. Eventually the German front began to collapse. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered. Most of them were regular Wehrmacht troops. They were exhausted. Starving. Relieved that the war was ending. But then there were the SS soldiers. And they were different. Very different. The Waffen-SS were the most fanatical troops in Hitler's army. They had been trained from the beginning to believe something terrifying. They believed they were the master race. Superior to everyone else. Superior to Americans. Superior to the British. Superior to the Russians. Even when they were captured, many SS officers refused to accept reality. They still acted like conquerors. They demanded salutes from American soldiers. They demanded private quarters. They demanded better food. They demanded the privileges of officers. And for exhausted American soldiers who had just survived the Battle of the Bulge. This arrogance was almost unbearable. Because only weeks earlier something horrific had happened. Something that changed the way many American soldiers saw the SS forever. It was called the Malmedy Massacre. During the battle, SS troops captured a group of American prisoners. The Americans had surrendered. They were unarmed. But instead of taking them prisoner, the SS machine-gunned them in the snow. Dozens of American soldiers were murdered. Some were shot while trying to run. Others were executed where they stood. When American troops later discovered the bodies frozen in the field, something inside them changed. The idea of a gentleman's war disappeared. And now, one of those SS officers sat inside a small holding room in a ruined German town. Waiting. The arrogant colonel adjusted his collar. He straightened his jacket. He waited calmly for the Americans to correct their mistake. Minutes passed. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. 30 minutes. 45 minutes. The room was silent except for the wind outside. Then suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Not the tired shuffle of a young soldier. These were strong, confident footsteps. Each step sharp. Authoritative. The SS officer looked toward the door. Something about those footsteps felt different. Then it happened. The heavy wooden door didn't slowly open. It exploded inward. Kicked open with incredible force. The door slammed against the stone wall with a thunderous crack. The German officer jumped. A massive figure stood in the doorway. The bright hallway light behind him made him appear almost like a shadow. But the SS officer could clearly see the details. A polished steel helmet. An immaculate olive-green uniform. 3 silver stars on the collar. And on the man's hip, a famous ivory-handled Colt .45 revolver. The German officer felt his stomach drop, because he instantly recognized the man standing in front of him. It was the one Allied general the German High Command feared more than any other. General George S. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army. And he looked very, very angry. For a moment, no one spoke. The room felt smaller the second General George S. Patton stepped inside. The SS officer slowly stood from his chair. His confident posture from earlier was gone. The arrogance that had filled the room only minutes before now felt strangely fragile. Patton didn't look at him right away. Instead, the general took a slow step forward. His boots echoed against the stone floor. Heavy. Sharp. Deliberate. Every step carried authority. In Patton's right hand was his famous leather riding crop. He lightly tapped it against his leg as he walked. Tap. 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 The sound was soft, but it filled the entire room. The SS officer tried to keep his composure. He straightened his uniform and lifted his chin, pretending he still had control of the situation. Patton finally stopped at the table. Still, he didn't look at the prisoner. Instead, he looked down at the floor. At the spilled coffee. At the shattered biscuits. At the dented tin of meat lying in the dirt. For several seconds, Patton simply studied the mess. Then slowly, very slowly, he raised his head. His eyes locked onto the German officer. Cold. Sharp. Unblinking. The SS officer felt a chill run down his spine. He had faced artillery. He had commanded troops in battle. But something about this man's stare made him deeply uncomfortable. Patton spoke at last. His voice was low, gravelly, but powerful enough to fill the entire room. "I hear," Patton said slowly, "that you don't like our food." The SS officer swallowed. For the first time since his capture, he felt unsure. But pride is a powerful thing. And Nazi officers had been trained never to show weakness. So he forced himself to speak. "General Patton," he said stiffly, trying to sound confident, "as an officer of the German military, I expect to be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Patton said nothing. The German continued. "I am entitled to proper officers' rations." He gestured toward the floor. "This garbage is not acceptable." The room went completely silent. The young American private standing near the doorway didn't move. He just watched. Patton slowly turned his head and looked back at the spilled food again. Then he looked back at the German. Still calm. Still silent. Then Patton took one slow step closer. The distance between them shrank. The SS officer suddenly realized just how physically imposing the American general was. Patton stood tall and solid, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. The smell of cigar smoke clung to his uniform. Patton leaned forward slightly. "A gentleman," Patton repeated quietly. The SS officer nodded, believing he had made his point. "Yes. As a gentleman officer." Patton's hand slammed down onto the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The German officer flinched. "Stand up!" Patton barked. The command exploded from him like artillery. The SS officer instinctively jumped to his feet. Years of military training forced his body to obey before his mind could react. He snapped upright. Patton stepped even closer. Now they were only inches apart. The German could feel the heat of Patton's breath. "You listen to me," Patton growled. His voice was no longer calm. It was cold, controlled, and filled with barely restrained fury. "My soldiers," Patton said, pointing toward the floor with his riding crop, "have been eating that same food for months." The riding crop tapped the dented tin can. Tap. They marched through snow and ice. Tap. They bled in frozen forests. Tap. They buried their friends in the mud. Patton's eyes burned with intensity. And they did it while kicking your army all the way back across the Rhine. The SS officer's confidence was collapsing. Patton pointed the riding crop directly at the Nazi's chest. "And now you sit here," he said slowly, demanding better food. The German officer tried to speak. "General, I simply request the rights of a..." Patton cut him off instantly. "A gentleman." Patton snapped. The word came out like poison. Patton leaned forward even closer. "Don't you ever use that word in my presence." The SS officer's face went pale. Patton's voice dropped lower now. Quieter. But somehow even more dangerous. "I know exactly what unit you belong to," Patton said. The room went deadly silent. "I've read the reports." The SS officer's breathing became shallow. "I've seen what your men did at Malmedy." The German froze. Patton's eyes hardened. "I've seen the bodies of American prisoners lying in the snow." His voice was now ice cold. "Unarmed men. Shot like animals." The SS officer couldn't speak. For the first time since the war began. He felt truly powerless. Patton straightened up. "You forfeited the right to call yourself a soldier the day you put on that uniform," Patton said. Every word struck like a hammer. "You are not a gentleman. You are not an officer. You are not even my equal." Patton pointed to the chair. "You are a prisoner." The illusion shattered. The proud SS officer who had demanded special treatment only an hour earlier now looked like a frightened man standing in front of a judge. Patton turned toward the doorway. "Private," he said calmly. "Yes, "General," the young soldier answered immediately. Patton nodded toward the floor. "Pick that food up." The private walked forward quickly. He knelt down and gathered the dented tin can, the broken biscuits, and the coffee cup. Dust clung to the food. He placed everything back onto the metal tray. Then he carefully set the tray on the table. Patton turned back toward the SS officer. "Sit down," he said. The German obeyed instantly. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered himself into the chair. Patton pointed at the tray. "That," Patton said slowly, "is your dinner." The SS officer stared at the dusty biscuits, at the dented tin, at the coffee. His mouth felt dry. Patton leaned down slightly so the German had no choice but to look into his eyes. "And if you don't eat every single bite," Patton said quietly, "I will personally make sure you don't receive another crumb of food until this war is over." The room felt frozen. "Do we understand each other?" Patton asked. The SS officer could barely lift his head. "Yes, General," he whispered. But the confrontation wasn't over yet. Because the most humiliating moment was still coming. The room was silent. The SS officer sat frozen in the chair. In front of him was the metal tray, the dented tin of meat, the broken biscuits covered with dust, the cup of lukewarm coffee. Only minutes earlier, he had thrown that food onto the floor in anger. Now it sat in front of him again, waiting. General Patton stood over him like a wall of iron. The German officer slowly lifted his eyes. But he couldn't hold Patton's stare for long. He looked back down at the tray. His pride was still fighting inside him. For years he had been taught something over and over again. That he was superior. That SS officers were the elite of the world. That Americans were weak, undisciplined, soft. That belief had been drilled into his mind during years of Nazi indoctrination. But now, sitting in that cold room, facing one of the most feared generals in the Allied armies, that belief was beginning to crack. Patton watched him quietly. The general didn't shout anymore. He didn't threaten him again. He simply stood there, waiting. And somehow that silence felt even more powerful. The SS officer reached slowly toward the tray. His fingers trembled. He picked up one of the broken biscuits. Dust clung to its edges. For a moment he hesitated. His pride screamed inside his head. But hunger was stronger. And fear was stronger than pride. Slowly, he lifted the biscuit to his mouth. He took a bite. The room stayed silent. The young American private standing by the door watched carefully. The SS officer chewed slowly. The hard biscuit cracked between his teeth. Crumbs fell onto the table. He swallowed. Then he reached for the tin can of meat. The metal lid had been bent when it hit the floor. He pulled it open. Inside was the same cold meat that American soldiers had been eating for months. He scooped a piece with the spoon. Then he ate. General Patton watched the entire time. His expression didn't change. The SS officer avoided eye contact. He kept eating. One bite. Then another. Each spoonful felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just food. It was humiliation. Every bite destroyed the illusion he had carried for years. The illusion of superiority. The illusion of the master race. The illusion that rank still mattered. Outside the broken window, the winter wind howled through the ruined German town. War had destroyed everything. Buildings. Roads. Families. Dreams. And now, it was destroying the last fragments of Nazi arrogance. After several long seconds, Patton finally spoke again. His voice was calm. But every word carried weight. "That food," Patton said, "is the same food my soldiers eat." The SS officer paused. Patton continued. "Those boys have been fighting through snow and mud for months. They sleep in frozen foxholes. They march until their feet bleed. And they do it because they believe this war must end. Patton stepped closer to the table. The SS officer slowly looked up. Patton's voice hardened. My men didn't cross an ocean to hear lectures about dignity from SS officers. The German lowered his eyes again. Patton continued. You talk about the Geneva Convention. You talk about rights. Patton shook his head slightly. You should have remembered those rights when your soldiers lined up American prisoners in the snow. The SS officer's face turned pale. Patton's voice dropped into a low, cold tone. The world will remember what your army did. And that's exactly why this war will end the way it does. The SS officer said nothing. There was nothing he could say. He continued eating quietly. The room felt heavy with the reality of defeat. Finally, Patton straightened his uniform. He adjusted his helmet. Then he looked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. The SS officer was still eating. Slowly. Quietly. Patton studied him for a moment. Then he spoke his final words. Welcome to American captivity. The words landed like a verdict. Patton turned and walked toward the door. His boots echoed across the stone floor. The young private stepped aside quickly. Patton walked out of the room without looking back. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the hallway. Then the lock clicked. Inside the room, the SS officer sat alone. The tray was still on the table. The biscuit crumbs. The dented tin. The cold coffee. He kept eating. Not because he wanted to, but because he understood something now. The war was over for him. The ideology he had believed in for years had collapsed. The myth of the master race. The belief that Nazis were superior. The arrogance that once filled his voice. All of it had been shattered. And it hadn't been destroyed by bullets. It had been destroyed by reality. Outside, the Allied armies continued pushing forward. City after city fell. The Nazi regime that once ruled half of Europe was crumbling. And inside that small holding room, one SS officer quietly finished his meal. The spoon scraped softly against the metal tray. That small sound echoed through the silent room. In the end, the myth of Nazi superiority didn't collapse with a dramatic explosion. It ended with something much simpler. The sound of a defeated man eating from a dirty American tray. History often remembers great battles. Explosions. Victory speeches. But sometimes, the most powerful moments are the quiet ones. Moments where arrogance meets truth. Moments where power shifts without a single shot being fired. And on that freezing morning in 1945, General George S. Patton reminded one Nazi officer of a simple reality. War had consequences. And the era of the master race was over.